that you either put in your bra, in your vagina, or in your butt.
Put what?
Drugs.
Why would I do that?
To not get arrested for it. So cut the attitude.
Okay, well, that's pretty.
She's searching you, and I'm giving you a chance.
Yes,
okay,
sir.
do you understand?
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Yeah.
so turn around. She's going to search you and put your hands up there.
You want me to take my jacket?
The encounter does not begin with chaos. It begins with certainty. Commands are delivered cleanly, efficiently, without hesitation. The officer's voice establishes control immediately, not through aggression, but through procedural authority. Park the vehicle. Turn it off. Keys on the roof. These are not requests. They are ritualized steps designed to assert dominance over the environment and the people inside it. From the very first seconds, the power imbalance is set, and everything that follows grows from that foundation. The stated justification arrives quickly. The vehicle is linked to a stolen tag. That declaration alone reshapes the entire interaction. In a single sentence, the occupants are no longer ordinary citizens in a traffic stop. They are now associated with felony-level suspicion. The law allows officers wide latitude when a vehicle is believed to be stolen, and that latitude quietly expands the scope of what officers believe they are entitled to do next. The individuals are separated, positioned, and monitored. The stop moves from inquiry to investigation. Yet even here, an important pattern emerges. The accusation is framed broadly, not precisely. The vehicle is not conclusively declared stolen. The tag is reported from a stolen vehicle. That distinction matters legally, but it is not treated as meaningful in the moment. The ambiguity works in the state's favor. Once suspicion is introduced, clarity becomes optional. The emotional weight of the word stolen does the work that evidence normally would. The canine deployment is the next escalation. Dogs are often described as neutral tools, but in practice, they function as force multipliers for suspicion. Once the dog is present, the stop takes on a predetermined trajectory. The occupants are repositioned under the justification of safety. The dog circles the vehicle, and when the alert comes, the entire encounter pivots. From that moment forward, the narrative hardens. Drugs are now presumed to be present, even though none have been found yet. This is where psychology begins to replace proof. An alert does not identify who possessed what, or when, or how. It simply signals that at some point, some substance may have been present. But instead of treating this as a narrow, investigative lead, the officers begin to widen their assumptions. The presence of paraphernalia inside the vehicle becomes a bridge to individual suspicion, particularly toward the female passenger. What follows is not a search driven by newly discovered facts, but a search driven by interpretation. The officers begin constructing a story in real time. The length of the stop, the way the vehicle pulled over, the clothing worn. Each detail is woven into a speculative theory of concealment. Importantly, this theory is not tested against alternative explanations. It is reinforced through repetition. The language shifts subtly but decisively. The woman is no longer being asked neutral questions. She is being confronted with conclusions. Her denials are not evaluated, they are discounted. When she attempts to explain her presence in the vehicle, the explanation is treated not as context, but as resistance. Her tone, not her facts, becomes the focus. And one's tone becomes evidence. The outcome is effectively predetermined. At this stage, authority is no longer about enforcing the law. It is about enforcing compliance. The officer frames honesty as a single, acceptable outcome. Honesty, however, is defined as agreeing with the officer's suspicions. Any deviation from that narrative is labeled attitude. This is a critical inflection point. Once disagreement itself is treated as deception, the legal safeguards designed to protect citizens begin to erode. The encounter now moves into its most dangerous phase: bodily intrusion justified by inference. The officers begin articulating possibilities of concealment in intimate areas. These statements are presented not as hypotheses, but as logical conclusions. The woman's clothing is cited as circumstantial evidence. The time elapsed is reframed as opportunity. None of these factors, individually or collectively, establish probable cause for an invasive search. Yet the certainty with which they are delivered creates the illusion that they do. This is the moment where power fully shifts. The officer's authority is no longer bounded by observable facts. It is bounded only by what he believes is reasonable. And reasonableness in this context is defined by experience rather than law. When the officer references years on the job, he is not providing evidence. He is asserting credibility as a substitute for it. Experience becomes the shield against accountability. The woman's protests escalate, not because she is guilty, but because the intrusion escalates. This distinction is critical and often misunderstood. Emotional response under pressure is not proof of wrongdoing. It is a predictable human reaction to perceived violation. But within the framework of the stop, her distress is reinterpreted as confirmation of suspicion. Resistance becomes justification. The search itself is no longer merely a search. It becomes a contest of wills. The officer frames compliance as the only path forward, while simultaneously threatening more severe consequences if compliance is not immediate. Jail, scanners, strip searches, these are invoked not as procedural necessities, but as leverage. The goal is not discovery, it is submission. What is striking here is how quickly the process abandons proportionality. The original justification, a tag linked to a stolen vehicle and a dog alert, has now expanded into an invasive search of a passenger's body. The escalation is not driven by new evidence, but by momentum. Each step justifies the next, simply because it has already occurred. This is how authority compounds, not through law, but through sequence. When the officer insists that honesty would have changed the outcome, the statement rings hollow. At no point is there a clear off-ramp offered. The woman is told she can avoid jail by producing something she insists she does not have. The choice is illusory. Compliance does not guarantee release. It merely accelerates the process. Throughout this phase, institutional normalization is on full display. Other officers do not intervene. The invasive language goes unchallenged. The assumptions are shared, not questioned. This is not the behavior of a rogue individual operating in isolation. It is the behavior of a system comfortable with its own authority. The moment chosen as the opening hook captures this shift perfectly. It is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is the precise instant where speculation is elevated to certainty and bodily autonomy is subordinated to suspicion. In that moment, the outcome of the encounter becomes almost inevitable. By the time physical restraint is introduced, the legal justifications are already layered into place. Paraphernalia, concealment, resistance. Each charge builds upon the last, creating a chain that appears strong but is built on assumptions rather than proof. The system does not require those assumptions to be correct, only consistent, as the woman is taken into custody. The contrast between her outcome and her brother's becomes stark. He is cited and released. She is detained and charged. The disparity is explained through selective interpretation of evidence, but it also reveals something deeper: how gender, perceived vulnerability, and bodily suspicion intersect in law enforcement encounters. This first part of the story is not about whether contraband existed. It is about how authority operates when suspicion is allowed to self-validate. It shows how quickly a routine stop can transform into an invasive ordeal when officers are permitted to treat intuition as fact and compliance as consent. Nothing in this encounter required urgency. Nothing demanded de-escalation. Each step was a choice, and each choice narrowed the space for de-escalation. The tragedy of this interaction is not that it unfolded unpredictably, but that it unfolded exactly as the system allows it to. By the end of this phase, the groundwork is laid. The narrative has been written. The institution will later point to the charges as justification, while ignoring the assumptions that created them. And the individual at the center of it all will be reduced, in official records, to a list of offenses stripped of the context that made those offenses possible. This is how misuse of authority rarely looks like a single dramatic violation. Instead, it looks like a sequence of reasonable-sounding decisions, each one building on the last, until reason itself is no longer questioned. By the time the handcuffs come out, the decision has already been made. What unfolds next is not an investigation searching for truth, but a process executing a conclusion. The mechanics of enforcement take over, and with them comes a revealing shift in tone. The officers are no longer probing, they are managing. Managing a detainee, managing a narrative, managing liability. This transition is subtle but decisive, and it marks the point where accountability becomes structurally unlikely. The justification for arrest is presented as cumulative. Each element is stacked on top of the last: the stolen vehicle association, the dog alert, the paraphernalia, the alleged concealment, the perceived resistance. Individually, many of these elements are ambiguous. Together, they are treated as conclusive. This is how weak foundations are often masked in law enforcement encounters. Not by strengthening evidence, but by multiplying allegations until the volume itself feels persuasive. The claim of resistance is particularly instructive. Resistance without violence is one of the most elastic charges in policing. It does not require physical aggression. It often requires little more than known compliance. As interpreted by the officer, here, resistance is not defined by an attempt to flee or to harm. It is defined by disagreement, by the refusal to conform immediately and silently to invasive commands. The line between asserting bodily autonomy and committing an offense disappears entirely. What is striking is how the officers narrate their own actions aloud. Statements about experience, about patterns they have seen before, about what usually happens. These are not made for the suspect's benefit. They are made to build a record. The body cam is not just recording events. It is being addressed. Each assertion functions as preemptive justification, anticipating future scrutiny and framing the encounter on the officer's terms. The language becomes instructional rather than explanatory. The woman is told how things work, what will happen next, why her behavior fits a known pattern. This is not dialogue. It is a monologue delivered under the guise of professionalism. The implication is clear. The system understands itself better than any individual within it, and questioning that system is evidence of guilt. When the officers reference scanners and strip searches, they are invoking the full weight of institutional power. These are not idle threats. They are routine tools of the carceral process. But their use here is revealing. They are presented not as safeguards or neutral procedures, but as consequences, punishments for non-compliance. The message is unmistakable. Submit now, or the system will assert itself more forcefully later. At this stage, the woman's agency is almost entirely erased. Decisions about her body, her movements, and her future are being made without her consent and without meaningful oversight. The fact that a female officer is involved does not mitigate the intrusion. It legitimizes it. Gender matching, often cited as a safeguard, becomes a procedural shield that allows invasive actions to proceed with reduced scrutiny. The discovery of an item does not resolve suspicion, it intensifies it. Rather than narrowing the scope of concern, the officers immediately suggest that more could exist. This is a critical dynamic. In a system driven by suspicion, confirmation does not bring closure. It brings escalation. Every find is treated not as an endpoint, but as evidence that deeper concealment must exist. The logic is circular and unfalsifiable. The woman's insistence that the item is benign is dismissed almost reflexively. Her explanation is not evaluated. It is overridden. What matters is not what the object is, but what it represents within the narrative already constructed. Once an officer decides someone is hiding something, any object becomes symbolic proof of deceit, regardless of its actual nature. As the officers prepare for transport, their demeanor shifts again. The tension dissipates slightly, replaced by administrative efficiency. This is another revealing moment. The emotional intensity of the encounter was not constant. It was situational. It flared during moments of challenge and subsided once control was re-established. This suggests that the conflict was never truly about safety or uncertainty. It was about authority being tested and then restored. The contrast between the treatment of the woman and her brother becomes more pronounced here. He is processed, quickly cited and released. The explanation is framed as purely legal, insufficient grounds to hold him further. But the subtext is unavoidable. His compliance, his demeanor, and the absence of bodily suspicion all work in his favor. The law is applied selectively, filtered through perception rather than principle. The officers speak candidly among themselves about outcomes. Charges are discussed as foregone conclusions. There is no hesitation, no deliberation captured on camera. This is not because the case is strong, but because the system does not require internal doubt to be expressed. Decisions are validated through consensus, not critique. What emerges clearly is the role of institutional momentum. Once an arrest pathway is chosen, reversing course becomes unlikely. Doing so would require admitting that earlier assumptions were flawed, that escalation was unnecessary, that authority was overextended. Institutions are structurally resistant to such admissions. It is easier to proceed, file charges, and let the downstream system absorb the consequences. The downstream system, of course, is the court. But courts rarely see the full context captured on body cam. They see charges, reports, and summaries filtered through prosecutorial discretion. Nuance is lost, tone is flattened. The emotional and psychological pressure applied during the encounter disappears, replaced by sterile legal language. What remains are allegations that appear coherent precisely because their origins are obscured. The officers repeated. Emphasis on honesty is perhaps the most ironic element of this phase. Honesty is framed as a moral obligation owed to the officer, not as a mutual principle governing the interaction. The woman is accused of lying. Yet the initial ambiguities of the stop, the stolen tag versus stolen vehicle distinction, the speculative nature of the dog alert, are never acknowledged. Honesty flows in only one direction. This asymmetry is central to understanding misuse of authority. Citizens are expected to be transparent under threat of punishment, while officers are permitted to operate within grey areas without consequence. The imbalance is not accidental, it is designed. The law grants officers discretion precisely because discretion facilitates control. But without robust accountability, discretion becomes dominance. As the transport begins, the narrative solidifies. The woman is no longer a person asserting her innocence. She is an arrestee defined by charges. Her earlier explanations, her protests, her distress, none of it travels forward with her into the system. What travels are the officer's interpretations, preserved in reports and citations. The body cam, ironically, becomes both witness and accomplice, recording everything, yet rarely altering outcomes. This part of the encounter illustrates how legality and legitimacy diverge. Many of the actions taken may fall within broad legal allowances. That does not make them just necessary or proportional. The law sets minimum standards, not moral ones. And when those minimums are treated as targets rather than boundaries, abuse becomes normalized. The system's final act in this phase is rationalization. The officers explain to each other and to the camera why things unfolded as they did. Experience is cited. Patterns are referenced. The woman's behavior is pathologized. These explanations serve a psychological function. They reassure the enforcers that their actions were not only permissible, but inevitable. Yet inevitability is a comforting myth. Every step of this encounter involved choice. Different questions could have been asked. Different assumptions could have been challenged. Different responses to distress could have been employed. None of those alternatives are explored because the system rewards decisiveness over reflection. By the end of part 2, the outcome feels settled. The machinery of enforcement has done its work. But the deeper consequences, the erosion of trust, the normalization of invasive suspicion, the quiet reinforcement of power imbalances, are only beginning. These consequences do not appear on charge sheets or sentencing documents. They accumulate invisibly, encounter by encounter, shaping how authority is exercised and how it is feared. This is the cost of a system that prioritizes control over understanding. And it sets the stage for the final reckoning, not in the courtroom, but in the broader question of what accountability truly means when the process itself is the punishment. The final stage of this encounter unfolds without urgency, and that calm is telling. Once the woman is secured and the immediate assertion of authority is complete, the system exhales. The officer's voices settle into routine cadence. Paperwork is discussed. Logistics are confirmed. The emotional intensity that defined earlier moments evaporates, revealing something fundamental. The conflict was never about danger. It was about control being challenged and then restored. This is the phase where institutional behavior becomes most visible, precisely because individual emotion recedes. What remains is process. The woman is now an object moving through a pipeline from roadside to patrol car to jail intake. Her personhood, so contested moments earlier, becomes irrelevant. She is no longer being evaluated. She is being processed. The officers speak openly about charges, about what will stick, about why one individual is released while another is detained. These conversations are not cynical, they are procedural. That is what makes them unsettling. There is no sense that something extraordinary has occurred. The invasive nature of the search, the speculative reasoning that justified it, the emotional distress involved, none of this registers as unusual. This is routine. The contrast in outcomes between the siblings crystallizes the power dynamics at play. The brother is cited and released, his involvement effectively reduced to administrative inconvenience. The woman is transported, charged, and later sentenced. This disparity is explained through the language of evidence, but the deeper explanation lies in perception. She was perceived as deceptive, non-compliant, and suspicious. He was not. The law did not change between them. Interpretation did. This is how discretionary systems produce unequal results without ever acknowledging bias. There is no need for explicit prejudice when subjective interpretation does the work. Tone, demeanor, gendered assumptions about concealment, and expectations of obedience all intersect to shape outcomes. The system can then point to its own procedures as proof of fairness, even as those procedures amplify inequality. The mention of sentencing at the end of the encounter underscores another uncomfortable truth. By the time punishment occurs, the foundational decisions are long past. The courtroom addresses charges, not the roadside dynamics that created them. Judges and juries rarely see the full chain of escalation, the speculative leaps, or the psychological pressure applied. They see a defendant and a list of offenses, stripped of context. Bodycam footage is often celebrated as a tool of transparency, but transparency without accountability is limited. Cameras record, but they do not intervene. They capture, but they do not correct. In this case, the presence of the camera did not temper behavior, it structured it. Officers narrated their actions, justified their assumptions, and performed professionalism for an unseen audience. The camera became a stage, not a safeguard. The system's confidence in its own narrative is evident in how casually the officers discuss prior experiences. References to past arrests, past discoveries, past outcomes are used to normalize present actions. This reliance on anecdote over analysis is a hallmark of institutional thinking. Patterns observed subjectively are treated as statistical truths, even when they are shaped by the very biases they reinforce. The woman's insistence on her own reality never meaningfully penetrates this framework. Her explanations are filtered through suspicion. Her distress is reinterpreted as manipulation. Her resistance is reframed as criminal. At no point is there a genuine effort to reconcile her account with the officer's assumptions. The possibility that she might be telling the truth is not explored. Because the system does not incentivize exploration. It incentivizes closure. Closure, in law enforcement, often means arrest. An arrest resolves uncertainty. It creates a tangible outcome that can be documented, justified, and defended. Walking away, de-escalating, or admitting insufficient grounds leaves ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable for systems built on authority. It is safer, institutionally, to act decisively and let downstream processes sort it out. This logic reveals a profound asymmetry of risk. For officers, the risk of over-enforcement is minimal. The system is designed to protect them through qualified immunity, prosecutorial discretion, and institutional solidarity. For citizens, the risk of under-enforcement is irrelevant. They bear the full weight of enforcement successes. Time in custody, public records, financial strain, psychological trauma. These costs are externalized entirely. The final moments of the footage showed the officers moving on, transitioning seamlessly to the next task. There is no reckoning, no reflection. The encounter is over for them. But for the woman, it is just beginning. The arrest is not the end of her involvement with the system. It is the entry point. Court dates, legal fees, potential employment, consequences, and the lasting stigma of charges all follow. Regardless of the ultimate legal outcome, what makes this encounter particularly instructive is its ordinariness. There is no dramatic chase, no physical violence, no explosive confrontation. This is not an outlier. It is a case study in everyday authority. It shows how power is exercised quietly, incrementally, and with plausible justification at every step. That is precisely why it is so difficult to challenge. Misuse of authority does not always announce itself with obvious misconduct. More often, it hides behind procedure. Each individual action can be defended in isolation. It is only when viewed as a whole that the pattern becomes clear. The stop escalates, not because circumstances demand it, but because the system allows it. The officer's final explanations about honesty, about experience, about how things usually go, function as moral closure. They reassured themselves that the outcome was earned. This self-justification is not malicious, it is human. But when embedded within a powerful institution, it becomes dangerous. It discourages self-scrutiny and rewards certainty over humility. The broader implication extends beyond this single encounter. When citizens observe or experience such interactions, trust erodes. Not because officers are enforcing the law, but because enforcement appears arbitrary and invasive. The message received is not follow the law and you will be fine, but submit completely or risk escalation. That message has profound consequences for civic life. Accountability, in this context, cannot be limited to after the fact. Review of charges. True accountability would require examining how suspicion is formed, how discretion is exercised, and how invasive actions are justified. It would require systems that reward de-escalation, that value uncertainty as a cue for restraint rather than aggression, and that treat bodily autonomy as a fundamental right rather than an obstacle. This encounter shows how far current practice falls from that ideal. It demonstrates a model of policing where control is prioritized, where compliance is conflated with truth, and where authority is rarely questioned from within. The result is a system that functions smoothly for those who operate it, and harshly for those subjected to it. In the end, the most consequential moment is not the arrest itself, but the earlier decision to treat suspicion as certainty. Everything that followed flowed logically from that choice. Once the narrative was set, the outcome was inevitable, and that is the most troubling lesson of all. When systems are designed to validate their own assumptions, injustice does not require bad actors, only unexamined power. The body cam captures the encounter faithfully. It shows us exactly how authority is exercised, justified, and normalized. What it cannot show is the weight carried forward by the person on the other side of that lens. That weight, invisible, unrecorded, and enduring, is the true cost of misuse of authority